All right. Thank you very much for sticking around. So I am going to be talking about herbivory, but first let me just talk about the latitudinal diversity gradient. This is one of those rare patterns in ecology that seems to really hold. So for most taxa, there's a very clear gradient whereby the species richness of most taxa is greater near the equator, and it declines as you go towards the poles. So that's quite well established, but what's less established is whether there's a parallel between this and a latitudinal gradient in biotic interactions. So these are biotic interactions like predation, disease, or herbivory. Now, ecologists have been interested in this for a very long time for very fundamental reasons to understand the world around us. But in recent years, there's been, of course, the big changes that are happening as our planet is warming, and species are responding to this warming by moving to higher latitudes. So they want to stay within their thermal tolerance ranges, and they move to where that temperature is. So in this context of climate change, as species move, understanding latitudinal patterns has become important because they provide a bit of a space for time substitution. So if we understand what makes things be the way they are here, we can forecast how things will be a bit, in higher latitudes in a few decades, for example. So what do we know about latitudinal gradients in biotic interactions? And there has been quite a lot of work in recent years. This is a very neat paper that was published recently with plasticine caterpillars as a bioassay to measure predation, and we can see that there's a very clear pattern with predation being stronger near the equator. So there's a few papers that have looked at predation patterns, and there seem to be some very strong gradients. How about herbivory? What do we know about how herbivory varies with latitude? And the situation is not as clear. So there is a paper by my colleague Angela Moles, based at Sydney, and she did a meta-analysis comparing herbivory along latitudinal gradients, and she found that it was a bit of a mess. There was no consistent patterns. So some studies showed no change across latitude. Some studies did show that herbivory was more intense near the poles, and some studies showed the absolute opposite. Now, the thing about the paper by Angela Moles, and this is acknowledged in the paper, is that this is actually based on quite a small number of studies, and these studies did not use consistent, rigorous methodologies. But also, I want to raise the issue that it's not clear what is meant by herbivory in the different papers. So, in some papers, they measure herbivory by simply measuring the proportion of leaf area consumed. But this, of course, depends on how long it's taken for that leaf to grow, right? So if you measure this area consumed in the tropics, and it's taken 1 week for this leaf to grow, that's going to be very different levels of herbivory than, if you find the same thing, but in a temperate leaf that has taken 2 months to grow, right? So I would argue that we need to measure herbivory as a rate, and this is something that we people working in seagrass meadows have been doing for quite a while, and this is work, for example, from Matt van der Clift, showing how you measure herbivory as a rate by measuring the area before and after, and then seeing how it's changed, and taking growth into account. And I'll point out that in Angela's paper, only 2 out of 38 studies actually measure herbivory as a rate. Now, what we know about marine systems and herbivory, so just after that paper by Angela Moles, my colleague Alistair Poore wrote this big review where he synthesized over 600 herbivore exclusion experiments to see what the patterns were at a global scale. And he found that on average, herbivores reduced primary producer biomass by nearly 70%. But when he looked at how these varied across latitude, he did not find this, more herbivory near the tropics. In fact, if anything, there's a very weak trend towards the opposite. More impact of herbivores in higher latitudes. And this is data from 1969 to 2009. When he looked at the pattern with temperature, and this is the temperature at each study site for over, the annual mean temperature, he found that there was an inverse relationship. So the impact of herbivory seemed to be greater in the cooler sites. Now, he also looked at how herbivory varies across different types of macrophytes, and here's where our seagrasses are. So seagrasses were actually not significantly different to zero in terms of herbivore impacts. So his study would show that herbivory is not really that important in seagrass ecosystems, but this was based on only 10 publications. So in this talk, I'm going to present the results from an expansion of that meta-analysis done in collaboration with Alistair Poor himself. And then I'm going to show you data from 2 empirical studies where we actually measured herbivory and production in the west coast of Australia and in the east coast of Australia. So this is the results of the meta-analysis. So we added a whole bunch of experiments done maybe by some of you between 2009 and 2015. This led to an increase in the number of sample units of 70%. And here we see that there was a significant effect of herbivores on seagrass abundance. So on average, herbivores reduce about 17% of seagrass abundance. In terms of a latitudinal pattern, though, there was no pattern at all, right? So there was no difference in how seagrasses are impacted by herbivores in different parts of the world. We then looked at the effects of temperature, and what was different in the way we did it is that we looked at the temperature, not the mean annual temperature, but the temperature during the time of the cage exclusion. And we see that there is a significant effect of temperature. But again, that pattern that Alistair was seeing holds. So the impact of herbivores seems to be greater in sites where the temperature is cooler. Now, however, we need to kind of realize that these measures of herbivory are a measure of the impact of the herbivore. You know, how does this patch of meadow change in the presence or absence of herbivores? They're not actually measuring the amount of herbivory going on, right? So to measure that, we did an empirical study. We collected data on herbivory and production of the seagrass Amphibolis Antarctica. We did this in 3 sites in Western Australia across 13 degrees of latitude. And we measured in situ herbivory, in situ leaf production at 3 sites, 3 regions, and we measured a whole bunch of other variables as well. The method that we used was modified by Dye Walker's method, and it basically is, you know, it involves painstakingly going to individual shoots and marking them with a number, and then marking, putting a mark in the shoot so that we know how many leaves are below and above that point. And we do this, we write down any marks of herbivory at the beginning, and then we go back and measure it again, and we also measure how much new leaf material has been produced. And these are the results. So we can see that in terms of the rates of herbivory, they are greater in the tropics. They are greater in the tropics, they decline towards Perth and towards Bremer Bay. The kind of solid colors are fish, so we could distinguish between fish herbivory and invertebrate herbivory. So we can see that in the tropics, 30% of the seagrass production is actually consumed, and it's consumed by fish, whereas in the cooler side, it's invertebrates that are doing the grazing. But this pattern is exactly matched up by production of leaves. So we see the same pattern. So yes, in the tropics there's more herbivory, but there's also more production, and in the cooler places, it's the opposite. So essentially, when you look at the net effects of the herbivores, it's similar across latitudes because higher production compensates for higher herbivory. And another thing to note is that the herbivory in the tropics is a lot more, consistent than in the cooler places. We also looked at nutrients, and what I want you to get from here is that in the cooler places, there was higher levels of nitrogen and lower levels of phenolics. So here, up to now, basically what we have is that the greater herbivory in the tropics is compensated by greater productivity, and that the impact of any increased herbivory that may happen because of climate change will depend on the ability of seagrasses to increase growth. And also that seagrasses in the colder side are less productive and more palatable, so potentially more vulnerable to herbivory. So if we see this continued expansion of tropical herbivores that we're seeing in different parts of the world, this is going to have potentially a great impact to temperate seagrasses from high latitudes. And this represents a new threat. Now I'll just finish up by presenting some preliminary data from my PhD student Ruby Garthwin. So she looked at a similar thing, but in the east coast of Australia. She looked at latitudinal patterns of production and herbivory in Posidonia australis. She had 5 sites across 9 degrees of latitude, but that includes the whole range of Posidonia australis on the east coast. And what I'm going to present is part of a greater experiment where she actually manipulated herbivory experiments. So she simulated the kind of increased herbivory that we may see in future years to see how the seagrasses respond. I'm not going to present that. I'm just going to present how does growth and herbivory vary with latitude. And essentially, we don't see the same patterns as with Amphibolis at all. So growth varies in different sites, but not in a predictable way with latitude. And neither does herbivory. So it's low and variable, but it doesn't follow a latitudinal pattern. Now, why may this be? So Amphibolis Antarctica in the west is located in very ocean-affected kind of conditions. These are the different sites that we worked in. And basically, the meadows are right on the coast, exposed to the ocean. In contrast, in the east, Posidonia australis is always found inside estuaries, not on the open coast. So potentially, we're seeing a different pattern in the east because over there, it's the local estuarine conditions that are more important than the larger scale latitudinal factors. But that's just a potential hypothesis. Thank you very much for your attention. Time for coffee then? Oh, one question.
Just one question, Adriana, comparing the west and east coast. Were the grazing rates similar on Posidonia compared to Amphibolis?
No, very, very, very low. In Posidonia australis, extremely low. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. Have you looked at the biomechanical properties of the seagrass leaf? Because it may be an important trait to explain herbivory patterns.
No, not in this particular study. In the past I have on other species, and yes, it tends to be important, especially for urchins, but, sorry, there's feedback. But not in this particular instance. But it did seem, yeah, like nitrogen explained. I think it's when you point it that way, that's when the feedback happens. But no, I didn't in this particular instance.
Nice presentation and nice study. I think that actually what comes to me is that when we look at all the effects of tropicalization or essentially trying to understand if herbivory is more intense in the tropics, that of course for coral reefs and other systems may hold very well because you have such a large diversity of fish herbivores which are clearly reduced when compared to seagrass meadows. But actually with the seagrass meadows, which have such a low, there are such a few actually true fish herbivores around every seagrass meadows over the world, that actually the presence of certain species that can be very important in certain temperate meadows and they don't exist in tropical, can actually reverse this trend. And what will be interesting to see is actually in seagrass meadows how the diversity of the fish actually change, because I think that actually that is completely different, and how many structural species actually exist, because that may reverse some of these ideas that come from just for the fact that they just don't exist. We have almost no true fish herbivores in tropical as strong as, for instance, there are some in the temperates, no? And that's my feeling, that some of these reverse patterns that we are finding is actually because maybe there are not fishes living in seagrass meadows that may perform this function.
So I think Matt van der Clift is going to present some work on looking at fish, that herbivorous fish in tropical seagrass meadows, because we know so little about them. So much work has been focused on the dugongs, on the turtles, but actually there's lots of fish that feed on seagrasses.
There are lots, but which role do they perform? Do they actually feed a lot on seagrass? Do they have the capacity to actually be an ecosystem engineer?
It's a good question, and from a study that we have done in a tropical system, they seem to be feeding mostly on the epiphytes. So yeah, there might be something.
Exactly. So I think that could be something which is actually reversing this pattern, that we actually are not we don't actually have strong ecosystem modifiers as herbivores on tropical systems, and I think that should be something maybe from the evolutionary point of view that we have to take into account.
Yeah, but in the West there was more herbivory in the tropics. It's just that there was also more growth, so the net impact was the same. Yeah.
Oh. Thank you.